Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan, and today we continue our series that looks at some of the most heroic soldiers in science fiction. Human soldiers, obviously, not aliens, because aliens are terrible. So far we've looked at commanders, lieutenants, captains, and sergeants, and now we'll continue to the rank of colonel. The colonel is represented by an eagle, the ultimate bird of prey. Typically, they were put in charge of a regiment or brigade-sized unit that usually amounted to several thousands of men. These officers not only commanded authority, but also a higher understanding of warfare than the common officer. Colonel Hyrum Graff was not what you would normally consider a hero. As an officer in the international fleet, he was more of a bureaucrat and administrator rather than a war hero. He was born after the Second Formic War when Major Rackham landed the killing shot against the alien mothership. In the decades after the Formic invasion, Major Rackham chose Hyrum Graff to find humanity's next hero and commanding officer in future wars against the Buggers. Earth had sent a fleet shortly after the Formic invasion to the Buggers' homeworld with an intent on destroying the aliens once and for all. Hyrum Graff helped create a battle school for the international fleet. It was an academy of sorts for some of the brightest young minds on Earth with a very heavy Hunger Games vibe. The intention was to find the best commanders on Earth and build a team around him or her and have them lead the human fleet via FTL communications. The international fleet believed that the fleet had to be commanded by children because of their more flexible minds and quicker reactions. This meant that Hyrum Graff had to push these brilliant children to their limits, oftentimes pitting them against each other, using mind games and other somewhat unethical methods. It was under Graff's supervision that humanity found Ender Wiggin, a natural leader both talented and empathetic. Ender was given special attention by Graff and pushed to his breaking point several times, but ultimately made it to command school where he faced his final test against a simulated Bugger army led by Major Rackham. Little did he know, Graff had lied to him about the whole situation. Ender wasn't actually facing Major Rackham, but already in command of the human fleet. Ultimately, it was Colonel Graff who had shaped the raw talent and genius that was Ender Wiggin, who defeated the Formics. And although the weapon and warrior who wields it are given most of the glory, the individual who forges the blade is equally as important. Colonel Hyrum Graff would later be court-martialed for his command of battle school, which had led to the death of a student at the hands of Ender Wiggin, which was all part of the mind games he was playing with the young man. Graff would go on to serve as the Minister of Colonization. He would take many of his former students and help them lead the future colonies of humanity and finally spread our people amongst the stars. Although Graff never fired even a bullet against a Formic warrior, he still was crucial for our survival. A former infantry commander in the U.S. Marine Corps, Colonel Miles Quaritch was a veteran of the resource wars that plagued Earth in the 22nd century. Fighting mainly with the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, Quaritch was a survivalist and an elite soldier. Like many soldiers, however, after a long career in service of a nation, Quaritch set out to earn some fair wages as a private contractor. He joins the Resource Development Administration mission to a nearby moon called Pandora to recover an essential resource that had the potential to save humanity. Despite nearly getting his face torn off by some giant monster on his first day on Pandora, Quaritch recognized the danger and challenges the moon presented him and elected to stay and face it. The man's conviction and skill in battle ultimately led him to being promoted as colonel and also the chief of security for the RDA mission. He was now not only responsible for keeping the RDA staff alive, he was also in charge of keeping humanity's best hope for survival safe. Unlike most of the civilians and scientist staff members on the mission, Quaritch saw the local Na'vi for what they actually were: savage aliens with a completely incompatible cultural system. Not only were they jealously guarding resources they had no true understanding of, they were now becoming increasingly hostile and ambushing human convoys and work teams. As the Na'vi began to organize into larger war parties, partly thanks to the human trader Jake Sully, Colonel Quaritch, faced with the realization that his small force of a few hundred men would soon be overrun by tens of thousands of giant blue aliens, attempts a last-ditch offensive to destroy the Na'vi's offensive capabilities. Although he is ultimately unsuccessful at holding back the massive Na'vi threat and dies in combat, he is still a hero for standing up against the evil Na'vi hordes and defending humanity. Colonel Victor Hoffman never wanted to be a high-ranking officer or a bureaucrat. He had fought on the front lines as a battlefield commander with his gears during the Pendulum Wars, and then through the Locust Wars and Lambient Invasion. Starting his career as an enlisted soldier, Hoffman showed he had what it took to lead other men into combat and quickly became an NCO and then was selected for officers training. He would go on to serve heroically in the 26th Royal Tyrant Infantry Battalion and took over command during the siege at Anvil Gate after an enemy rocket took out the commanding officer. Hoffman would never really look back after that and would continue on fighting and quickly ascend the ranks of command. By Emergence Day, Victor Hoffman had been promoted to the rank of colonel, but he was still kitted in full body armor and holding a Lancer assault rifle. Now, as the director of Special Forces, Hoffman also had access to the powerful Hammer of Dawn. He was oftentimes faced with horrible dilemmas, like firing on friendly cities in order to halt the Locust advance. Although Colonel Hoffman was a terrific leader, he was also a strict adherent to discipline. This oftentimes put him at odds with more unorthodox soldiers like Sergeant Marcus Phoenix. But when it came to actual fighting, Hoffman was still an infantry soldier at heart and still ventured onto the battlefield even as a colonel. On one mission during the evacuation of North Gate, he was injured in the leg but refused painkillers and tried to walk off his injury. Despite constantly exposing himself to battle, Colonel Victor Hoffman would become one of the last surviving high-ranking officers in COG, and eventually became the chief of COG Defense Staff. After the sinking of Jacinto and the disappearance of the chairman of COG, Hoffman once again stepped up against his own self-interest and tried to keep the coalition together. Colonel Victor Hoffman was a reluctant leader who oftentimes had to step up, despite the fact that all he really wanted to do was saw a godless locust in half with a chainsaw. Colonel Benton Cora is most likely a rebel you've never heard of. He has maybe one line in the Star Wars film during the Battle of Yavin, and he probably doesn't even have an action figure. But officers like Benton Cora kept the Rebel Alliance running and alive. Serving directly under General John Donana, he was an experienced starfighter pilot at a time when the Rebel Alliance had almost none. His reports and suggestions about the X-Wing was a major reason why the Rebel Alliance adopted the Snub Fighter as the backbone of their starfighter corps. He also helped select the very capable UT-60D starfighter as a transport for Rebel Special Forces. Colonel Cora helped devise a training program for the new pilots who were joining the lines, and also helped set up patrols around Rebel bases like the one on Yavin 4. As the rebellion grew in size, Colonel Cora worked with General Antok Merrick, who was in charge of the Starfighter Command, and helped run the unit's day-to-day activity. Ultimately, Colonel Cora lost his life at the Battle of Makota Space Docks when the Rebel Alliance was betrayed to Darth Vader's fleet. Cora would die in the fighting after volunteering to fly a shuttle in order to open sabotage hangar doors on a Mon Cala cruiser. Colonel Cora died a very heroic death, but his achievements went on without being recognized. Without his influence, the Rebel Starfighter Corps would have looked drastically different and might not have been able to perform as well as it did. The X-Wing would become essential to the Rebel Alliance's strategy and even force the Empire to develop new fighters to counter it. And who knows how the Battle of Yavin would have went had Luke Skywalker been piloting the much less armored A-Wing. Born to an Enclave high-ranking scientist, Augustus Autumns was one of the luckier humans in the Fallout universe. The Enclave was a direct descendant of what used to be the US government. The group had access to medicine and technology that no other faction had. Autumn's father had been ordered to lead a group of Enclave soldiers east towards the capital wasteland in what used to be Washington, D.C., for an important mission to exterminate the entire continental US from mutant beings, which was basically everyone. They would do this by taking control of an experiment known as Project Purity, which could potentially purify massive amounts of irradiated water. The Enclave's president secretly wanted to introduce a virus into the new clean water supply that would eradicate any humans with even the slightest mutations, which again was everybody. At one point, Augustus Autumn was promoted to the rank of colonel and put in charge of the Enclave military forces. Not nearly as trusting as his father, Colonel Autumns was suspicious of the intentions of President Eden. Upon finding out that the president was actually a supercomputer, the colonel made sure he had a self-destruct code for the president in case he ever got out of control. He feared that the president's measures were oftentimes far too harsh. But at the same time, he was a firm believer of returning the wasteland to glory under the legitimate continuation of the U.S. government. He also believed that humanity, even the ones that were affected by radiation, were worth saving and uplifting. His ultimate goal was to take Project Purity for himself and use it to bring peace and civilization back to the wasteland. So there you have it, guys. That is our list of the most heroic colonels in human history and science fiction films. Let us know in the poll in the top right corner which one you think is the most heroic. Anyway, guys, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.